Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm here with a member of Knesset, Michal Cotler-Wunsh. Did I pronounce that right?
It's Wunsh.
Wunsh.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us. This is going to be, you're involved in so many fascinating things that are very, very current. So this is going to be a little bit of a sort of a introductory, going over some of these things, asking questions about how they relate. And I want to start right off and move fast through all these different issues. You are involved. First of all, you're an attorney who's worked with some serious Israeli judges that people will know, Miriam Naor, Aaron Barak, people who went on to become Supreme Court Chief Justices in Israel, and are familiar with Israeli law and are turned to even in the Knesset on legal issues. And you're right now, I think, leading the issue of Facebook and Twitter and anti-Semitism on Facebook and Twitter. And I'm trying to create a responsibility for the platform for some of the content involved on there. Now, just one sentence, we've just experienced this question with the American elections, right? Where suddenly Twitter is tagging what are believed to be completely dishonest statements by politicians, but that raises questions and concerns of what does that mean that the social media network is now questioning, the presidents are allowed to lie, politicians are allowed to lie. It's not always a lie. Some lies are lies, some lies are something else, slightly less of lies. Human contact and communication is very complex. Tell us what you're doing and tell us sort of how you navigate that very complicated question. We don't want anti-Semitism on Facebook. Do we want Facebook policing?
So first of all, thank you, Chaviv, for starting with that. And I'll say this, that I actually, and maybe before I entered Knesset, actually, my doctoral research is about freedom of speech on university campuses, so off digital platforms, but with very same sort of, I'd say, parameters for understanding that in the free speech debate, first of all, censorship is a real challenge, and actually the regulation of speech on university campuses, and I don't know if you're familiar with speech codes and microaggressions, trigger warnings, safe spaces that exist in North American campuses, as they're
I've
called.
Heard about them. We hear about them, but only negative things.
So I would say that really, what we saw play out on campus, whether it's negative or positive, is really a whole, other discussion that we can have. And by the way, part of the fascinating understanding of what has happened, or, there are people who would call it the numbing of the American mind and so on. You might be familiar with some of the writings, Jonathan Haidt. Some of the interesting things are actually, that off-campus, on-campus, especially in the case, let's say, the United States of America. So freedom of speech off campus is, almost unlimited, clear and present danger, barring that. The Canadian model is a little bit different. Hate speech, incitement, I would say, is a little bit less of a, complete freedom. Nonetheless, on campus, there's a whole other degree of regulation of speech. And I would say that actually that informed my entrance into Knesset in many ways, and maybe we'll talk about a few other of the issues that I'm involved in. But in that sense, that tension between free speech and censorship, and who do we want to be in charge of deciding what is free speech and what is censorship? And with regards to digital platforms, actually, the hearings that were held, actually at the Aliyah and Klita committee. And the reason that they were held there were because of anti-Semitism, and actually not only because of anti-Semitism online or on digital platforms, but off on the streets. And as a result of, and I'm not sure if you were familiar with the No Safe Space for Jew Hate campaign on Twitter, it followed some very anti-Semitic tweets by a personality by the name of Wiley in the UK, upon which, politicians and public figures in the UK and all over the world. Actually, I joined this blackout on Twitter. It was a 48-hour blackout, really just to flag that there is a real issue. And those three hearings that were held at the committee, Twitter appeared and Google and Facebook, and actually TikTok, who we were unsuccessful for the first two hearings, agreed to join the third hearing. And the point of the discussions were really, first of all, as a lawyer, we're really to say, in order to address a problem, we first have to define it. And in this case, there is a working definition, the IRA working definition, that's been adopted by about 30 countries throughout the world, that serves as the point from which to begin to create policy policy that is transparent, policy that is then enforced transparently. And those are the discussions that we had with the platforms. But in fact, in many cases, and if there was an IRA working definition adopted in the case of anti-Semitism, exactly what you described at the beginning is a really useful tool. Because if you, instead of going to that binary discussion, censorship versus free speech, say what is the responsibility of the digital platforms, and they hold all this power, and with that power comes tremendous responsibility, and we have to hold them to account, it would be education, right? If that resource is available, that clicking through or that tagging, as you called it, then we can also refer out. We can say, well, this consists of, a violation of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and here it is. We can refer you out to IRA and enable you to know what is anti-Semitism. Or in the case of TikTok, with a really virulent campaign that was a Holocaust denial campaign, that it's called Point of View. I don't know if you were familiar with this. It was a challenge to dress up as Holocaust survivors or non-survivors, and including makeup and dressing and so on. But the point was to say there are 40% of users on TikTok are teenagers. They don't even know they're engaging in Holocaust denial. But if we had that ability to reference them out to IRA, to the working definition of IRA, which includes Holocaust denial, by the way, it also includes the 3 Ds, delegitimization, demonization, and double standards against the state of Israel, we would be able to actually use this tool as an educational tool, rather than remain in the very easy, what's censorship or what's, freedom of speech.
What do you hope social media companies actually impose? You want to see tagging of that sort, or what, or links out of information when it pops up on their algorithm that this is that kind of content? Should someone sift through? Should there be appeals process? Should they actually erase, content?
So it's a very interesting question. Look, I mean, actually, after the 3 discussions or hearings we held at the committee, I was actually very successful at creating an interparliamentary task force, nonpartisan, with members from Canada, the United States, the UK, Australia, Israel, New Zealand, that will be joining us, the 5 Eyes plus Israel, so the 6 Eyes, we've called it thus far, with hope that we engage in, first of all, acknowledging that this is a global issue. It's very specific to combating online anti-Semitism at the moment, but I would say global anti-Semitism is really the canary in the mine shaft. And we are looking at the challenge with regards to the digital platforms generally. And actually, it was received with incredible recognition actually in the United States. It happened to have coincided also with a hearing that took place in the United States, the hearings that we held here. But in general, the understanding that there is a tremendous sense of lack of responsibility and lack of accountability. And what is our role? And I believe Mark Zuckerberg even referenced to this. So the governments also have to take an active step in understanding what is governmental role, because the truth is, I don't want Facebook in, deciding what free speech should look like, or an algorithm, worse yet. And it becomes even more complex, because really it is about the business model of, digital
attention,
platforms.
Of drawing attention, creating these echo chambers that engage you more and more, get you emotionally invested. How do they then sort of decouple those 2 problems? This is the business model, this is the structure, this is what the algorithm is built to do, and yet we want them to be responsible.
So I don't know if you saw The Social Dilemma, but I
didn't. I saw The Social Network. Yeah.
I recommend watching The Social Dilemma. It's it's a very fascinating understanding of the people who design the algorithms and in fact how it works, and also in exposing the problem in a very broad way. So this is not about online anti-Semitism or about any other form of hate and incitement. It's about all of it, and the way that each of us actually we are being mined. We are the data mining, right? It's a very interesting understanding that I think that all legislators and all legislatures will have to address. The understanding that we have for now is actually to begin with this issue. But there is no doubt that we, or at least I have no doubt, that we have to engage with the digital platforms in order to be able to advance this. I don't think that it'll be able to be done without the digital platforms. And we've engaged in discussion each of the platforms, you know, has chosen a different path in engaging with this topic, which is very, you know, complicated for them. And the business model works right now. So until they're held to account, there's no reason for them to voluntarily go through the, you know, jump through the hoops in order to regulate this. But
the very painful hoops. Right.
Very painful hoops. But I do believe that in that sense, if we are to demand, or globally to demand, some sort of a code of ethics or an understanding that first of all, our collaboration would lead them, all digital platforms, to have to collaborate or sort of adjust the current understanding or lack of understanding of how we address this together. And in that sense, information share, meaning this is not going to be able to be part of their business model. I think that we're at the beginning of a process. We're far from resolving it. It is a very important process. And I think that taking responsibility together in this way is also an indication of how serious this is globally for legislatures. And so when I interact with my fellow parliamentarians throughout the world on a topic like this, and it is a nonpartisan engagement, it transcends, you know, geographic boundaries and so on, and we acknowledge that this is a global problem that will have to be addressed globally, even just in that, I think that there is a statement to be made vis-a-vis the digital platforms, hoping that we advance the conversation further, for sure.
It's fascinating that the Israeli Knesset is taking this seriously at a time of political, I don't want to say dysfunction. I don't want to be impolite, but dysfunction. Just, you know, we don't have a budget. We just had a cabinet meeting today. Once again, a state budget for 2020 or 2021 were not on the agenda. The political system is profoundly stuck. The major positions in the health ministry in the middle of a pandemic are not being staffed. The same goes for the finance ministry. We're run on stopgap, you know, spending bills that keep making up for everything that's missing. Netanyahu and Gantz are still spending it. The impression in the public is that they're spending much of their time maneuvering around each other rather than running the many desperate things the country needs run. Let's just take a few minutes, you know, 3 minutes, whatever you want to say about just the sense of political malaise, the sense that things are stuck. And if you had to bet, when would you bet we're headed for elections?
I'll start with the fact that none of this is going away just because we are challenged, both politically or because of COVID-19, economically, health-wise, mental health-wise. None of this is going away, whether it's combating anti-Semitism or the ICC, so Israel standing in the international arena, or Israel diaspora relations. And these are issues that brought me to the Knesset. These are the issues that I'm committed to advancing, in addition to those internal issues which you've so aptly, you know, touched upon. And I sit on many committees, Chaviv, including in those committees, I chair, for example, the committee on coping with addictions to drugs and alcohol. Okay, so through that committee, for example, I can tell you that I'm exposed to the, I would say, societal, emotional challenge alongside the, you know, health and economic challenge or crisis. And I would say it is a crisis. The issue of addictions is one that we have to close so many gaps regarding. And I often say this in all the committees that I sit in. COVID-19 hasn't invented anything new. It's only shed light on everything that was bubbling below the surface. And that's true for us internally, and everything that you've touched upon, on the political challenges that we've had, on the internal rifts of Israeli society, on the challenges of lack of, let's call it, good governance, long-term planning. That has always been there. It's not new. It's just that COVID-19 has absolutely no ability to, you know, sort of enable that to continue if we are to face the internal challenge.
Right, but let me challenge you on that. Just it feels like it's getting worse, right? You chair it's a special committee meant to deal with what is a crisis, the question of addictions and drugs and alcohol and the different things that the committee deals with. There are committees that are fundamental to oversight of the most important and things in government, from defense to health to all these different schools, the education system, which is limping along, unable to, you know, parents don't know a day before whether schools are are open or not, or the people who can least afford to be hit are the ones hit, right? The special education kids whose special tutors find out that they're fired for the first month of the school year, which happened, and only actually can then have someone with them the second month of the school year, literally just because the Knesset wasn't able to pass the right little amendment to the right little bill on time. There's no state budget where things happen automatically. There's so many ministers that even with the Norwegian law where some MKs become ministers, there just aren't enough MKs. You could tell us about your committee. I suspect it's not very well, the MKs don't show up, attended, because there are 6 other committees for every MK. The work is not getting done in a way that, I've been in this business about 15 years. I don't remember this 15 years ago. And there were problems and there were troubles and there were, and all the things, and budgets were being fought over and politicians hated each other. I don't remember an education committee not having people attend when schools haven't opened and the education minister is yelling and just not being dealing with. Anyway, tell us about how that feels from the inside, because I, of course, am watching from the outside.
First of all, I think, Haviv, the tremendous sense of responsibility that I feel, and literally a sense of urgency that I feel is a direct result of everything that you're describing. So we are really on the brink of in terms of like the political ability to work together, we are on the brink of collapse. It's not that the committees aren't doing their work. There is committee work being done, but the potential that we have is not at all anywhere that it should be in what I would call a corrected democracy. There are no long-term plans, as I said, for the Ministry of Education, for health, security is the only ministry, as you probably know, that has long-term plans. And even that hasn't been approved with the fact that a budget hasn't been passed. So this is not the way to run a country. That is clear to me on many levels. And that's not to say that working in Knesset under these conditions is not frustrating. It's not only frustrating, but as I said, the tremendous sense of responsibility to advance this forward in this difficult time is one that leaves me with a real sense of urgency and a tremendous sense of responsibility. And I also think that herein lies the opportunity. And I will keep saying that, because Israel, the 72-year-old miracle that is the state of Israel. And I remind people, I grew up in Canada. Canada at 72 still had residential schools. It was busing children off for re-education. And that's not that we have the luxury at 72 to be doing things that aren't, properly done, but that is the opportunity that we have. Because as I said, I really think that COVID-19, everybody talks about going back to routine. God forbid we should go back to routine and not create a new routine. This is almost like a direct track of what we should be doing. When you look at the education system, okay? I'm Canadian, I miss Sundays, but it's clear that we should be going towards a 5-day school day aligned with a work week so that both parents can work, a longer day where, you incorporate whatever we consider as after school activities into the school day, whether it's sports or music or arts and so forth, an improved, a reformed educational system that actually fits 2020 and isn't a remnant of some, former understanding of what education should be. And actually, it's happening in many ways. You look at these capsules and, 5 days, of a schooling that actually is now challenging teachers to utilize technology to, I'm not saying we're nearly there. I'm saying we have the opportunities to shine the spotlight on everything that we should be changing. Same with healthcare. Same with everything that requires long-term plans in advance. Same with the third sector, by the way. The third sector that has stepped in instead of government in so many of these issues.
The nonprofit sector.
Yes, thank you. The nonprofit sector. I once conducted a research as a legal researcher on non-for-profit, on the entire legal services rendered and utilized by the non-for-profit sector. There are 40,000 organizations in this country, Haviv, 40,000 organizations that are actually stepping into what we, the civilians, the citizens of the state of Israel, need. And the government often doesn't even know, and I can, name some that everybody would be familiar with, Leket and Shalva and Lard, incredible non-for-profit organizations that actually are life itself for each of us. We use their services in many ways. So this is an opportunity, and I keep shining the spotlight on that. And as long as I'm in Knesset, I will keep doing that in all of the committees that I sit in, because that is my commitment. I mean, it's why I entered and believed we should enter this unity government. And the process may be longer than we thought it would be to begin a reconciliatory process, to begin a truth and reconciliation and a healing process of good governance and long-term planning and so forth. But neither are we free to desist from it.
This is a very frustrating conversation because it feels like the beginning of 7 different conversations. The education question is enormous. We have so many redundancies. We have the different education streams that all have to run their own curriculum. We have all these different questions and problems. It's a black box. We have this thing in the education system called projektorim. Every minister shows up and has their little thing that they want to do, and they take a projektor, a project manager, they hand them 100 million shekels or 10 million shekels or whatever, and then principals come from schools and ask for money for the project and then run it in their schools. And there's just billions sloshing around, not going to hours and teaching hours and things we actually know what's happening in the system. There's so many problems in the system, and it's considered a great success if an education minister manages to open the school year. So there's so many questions that I'd love to get into. I'm going to wind down to one last one, and then you'll have the last word, and also raise any issue that you want to raise at the end, because I want to keep this short, and I'd like our viewers to come asking your office for more information on all these things. Describe to us what it is you're doing related to the International Criminal Court and international law. You're essentially an envoy of the Knesset.
So I'm not an envoy of the Knesset to the ICC. As you well know, Israel's not a state party to the Rome Statute. We aren't a party to the ICC at all. What I am is the representative of the Knesset to the subject. And I view that as basically my mandate has 2 sides to it. The first is internal within Knesset. So I sit on, the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee, and I sit on various other committees where we sit around tables and we make all kinds of decisions. But if we're not fully aware, and if the viewpoint diversity is such that there is no understanding of that additional, I would say, real strategic threat to the state of Israel in the international arena, then we are not making the best decisions we can be making. If there are members of Knesset, and there are, who are not aware of a pending decision at the ICC and its implications and its connection to, let's say, the Goldstone report or to the, a blacklist.
I hate to cut you off, but I think you've gone into a topic that is urgent and critical. Can you tell us about, instead of the committee itself, but where do things stand? We know that they're deciding, opening, thinking, contemplating. They have to give responses to each other within the court process. Where do things stand, and should Israelis be worried? You are, I don't know how many of the viewers know, an international law expert on top of all the other things that you're doing. So this is a great opportunity that we shouldn't miss. Where do things stand for us?
So first of all, we don't know what the prosecutor's decision will be, but ultimately the prosecutor's decision, and this is very important, is not just regarding Israel. It will affect Israelis, right? So Israelis will be able to be held to account for crimes against humanity conducted, during the Gaza war, what we know as Operation Protective Edge in 2014. But I want to explain something, and I want to explain why this is important, that our MKs are familiar with this issue, but also why it's important, imperative, that we can make these representations formally and informally to our peers around the world. And we have all kinds of engagements, formal and informal, in friendship circles and in more institutional settings, the IPU, the OSCE, the European Parliament. We engage with parliamentarians around the world, and they are keenly familiar with this topic. And the reason that it's important to them, and you have to understand this, first of all, there are fundamental issues that are going to be compromised, and already are compromised, by the way, no matter what the prosecutor decides, such as complementarity. So the state of Israel, the rule of law, a well-respected, judicial court, you refer to some of those international justices revered around the world. Complementarity says the following: if a country has that mechanism, then the ICC actually has no jurisdiction over it. The ICC's very limited resources have to be utilized to uphold, protect, and maintain the rights of people where crimes against humanity are in systems that don't have the rule of law, that don't have judicial systems, whether it's the Uyghurs in China or women in Iran or the people of Venezuela, that actually have no recourse. So the fact that the court would use its limited resources has implications, as I said, for the very mandate of the court, for the vision, the mission, and the values of the court, that the state parties to the Rome Statute should actually be very preoccupied with, not Israel, and certainly not just Israel. Secondly, it's very important that people understand the ICC received representations, countries that submitted their own standing on the fact that the Palestinian Authority actually, it's not its own entity. So the ICC can only have jurisdiction to what's recognized as a country. And you know, as Palestine is not a country as of yet, according to, I'll tell you, the Czech Republic and Australia and Brazil, Austria, Germany, Canada submitted a letter, not actually an amicus brief, but all of those countries submitted amicus briefs. Now, if you actually take a moment and pause on that, if the ICC and the prosecutor should decide that it is ignoring all of those countries' stances on this issue, then what does that mean with vis-a-vis any other decision that this court will take? And if the court should decide that it does have the jurisdiction to investigate the allegations, then those countries essentially have to come to the fore and engage with the ICC's mandate or failed ability to live up to its mandate.
Are we essentially saying the court has a trap before it, right? The low-hanging fruit of crimes it can investigate, crimes it can complain about, without having the kind of blowback that'll be disastrous for the court, are the crimes committed by countries that can also look into those crimes and have legal systems in our democracies. Democracies are easier to complain about, right? When is the ICC going to tackle China? Well, it's never going to tackle China. So it's almost a self-made trap for the court, where it's going after the low-hanging fruit and maybe calling into question why we need one. So
at least I'm consistent, and you can call me an optimist, but that is the opportunity for reform. So the opportunity for the reform of the ICC actually it lies exactly in your question. If indeed the countries that are entrusted with international law and human rights, upholding, maintaining, and protecting, that is really our shared vision, our shared understanding of our commitment as trustees to human rights and international law, then this would be the indication for the desperate, the imperative need for reform so that the ICC can fulfill its mandate. And I believe that many of those countries, and part of this actually relates to the discussion with regards to anti-Semitism or Twitter, if we take it back to that. Some of the issues that need to be addressed is the exposure of double standards. When there are double standards or inconsistent application of law, when those are enabled to exist and actually either ignored or empowered, then we actually cultivate a continued culture of impunity. And we see the ramifications of that everywhere. We see it with the support of terror by terror funding regimes. We see, and I have to, acknowledge the other thing that actually brought me into Knesset, and that is the case and cause. We call it the golden case and cause, but really the case and cause of 2 deceased soldiers and 2 Israeli civilians, again, held in standing violation of almost 6.5 years of international law, and met with silence. And actually, we've garnered support around the world for the violation of international law, the blatant violation of international law. Hadar Golden, in this case, was actually abducted and killed 1 hour after a humanitarian ceasefire brokered by the United States and the UN and supported by the EU went into effect. 1 hour later, he was killed and abducted. And from that day forward, we are in standing violation of fundamental principles of international law. And here is another fundamental principle, that of reciprocity. Humanitarian aid flows into Gaza regularly, and the very same terror organization holding 2 Israeli deceased soldiers and 2 civilians whose whereabouts we don't know, by the way, from an intersection of Israeli society, Hadar Golden, Oron Shaul, Avera Mengistu, and Hisham Sayed, note the wide range of Israeli society represented there. Silence. In that case, I'd say reciprocity, again, a fundamental principle of international law. the very same people holding those 2 soldiers, 2 deceased soldiers and 2 civilians hostage are also holding 2 million civilians hostage. And when I say the culture of impunity, or the continued culture of impunity, when we don't call on double standards, when we don't apply the principles equally, consistently across the board, that is what we all have to contend with at this point in time.
Okay, this, some members of Knesset, they talk about each other mostly. These are multiple conversations with you at all times, so it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you. We're following all the things you're doing, and there's so much to unpack, and we'll be meeting again and talking again about all of these many issues. I'm about to ask you, did we miss anything? Of course, we missed a very great deal. We missed a lot of your biography. Everybody, please go, to Wikipedia and learn about one of our more active MKs in a Knesset that is enough to make one want to be less active, and yet you managed to be very active. So that is something that is very visible and very powerful. And thank you very much.
One word,
what do you want to, please?
One word is to Olim. Olim from all over the world, and I don't differentiate. I think that Olim have a tremendous importance in the viewpoint diversity that is underrepresented. I think we have to lean in. It's part of the mission that's led me to Knesset, and maybe to taking responsibility and the sense of urgency that I feel is part of that as well. I think that COVID-19 again has really created additional challenges for Olim at this time in particular. I'm well aware of them and very committed to raising those voices. And I think that it's very important that we understand that the mental health crisis that I was referring to, and I think that all Israelis are really, alongside the economic, alongside the health crises, are really facing. I think that Olim have an additional component, but I do want to implore and encourage Olim from all over the world. I believe that we have a very important voice, a very important viewpoint diversity, and a very important ability for hybrid identities or multiple identities or mediated identities that we bring to the fore, and that Israel really needs. The miracle that is the state of Israel really needs as Jewish and democratic. And if I might say one last thing, my first bill proposed in Knesset was actually around the Declaration of Independence and turning it into a, Chok Yesod, a basic law and Declaration of Independence. And I think that Jewish and democratic, because I touched upon it, and we didn't speak at all about Israel-diaspora relations, it addresses our challenges with regard to Israel-diaspora relations. It addresses many of our challenges right here internally, Israel's right to exist as Jewish and democratic with everything that means, and also in the international arena. We spoke about the ICC, we spoke about international law, and we spoke about human rights, and we spoke about the imperative to create an understanding that we have to apply those consistently. We can continue talking about that another time, but Olim have a very important voice in all of those issues.
And should get into Israeli politics. Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us, and we will circle back in the future, hopefully often.
Thank you, Habib. Thank you for the opportunity.